Hey friends, welcome back. Just Christina here, and today we're going to go through this pamphlet called A Dozen Good Reasons to Get Us Out of the United Nations. And of course, you can see it's a play on words. Us is the U.S., so that's who they're referring to. This is written by the John Birch Society in 1985. So let's go ahead and go through this because there are 12 really key points that are still relevant to the situation of government and what we're seeing today. And of course, it just flips the script from one nation to another. And now we're seeing it with those IRA countries, if you will, the N and the Q. But let's just begin, okay, because this is really interesting. All right, more and more Americans are coming to the chilling realization that U.S. membership in the United Nations poses a very real threat to our survival as a free and independent nation. Here are some good reasons to be concerned. And of course it does, because if we hand our sovereignty over to the United Nations and allow them to control us, police us, and make our laws, then we as the United States cease to exist in a life as we know it. All right, number one, the UN's basic philosophy is both anti-American and pro-totalitarian. Our Declaration of Independence proclaims the self-evident truth that men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. But in its covenant on civil and political rights, the UN ignores God's existence, implying that it grants rights, and then repeatedly claims the power, as provided by law, to cancel them out of existence. So they're making the laws and then they're canceling the laws. If any government can place restrictions on such fundamental rights as freedom of speech, the right to keep and bear arms, freedoms of the press, association, movement, and religion, soon there will be no such freedoms. And we're seeing these threatened now. We're seeing the right to bear arms as a very controversial topic of debate, and it always is. And the same with some of these other topics, freedom of press, freedom of speech. These are all our fundamental rights to be able to express ourselves, and these are the rights that were given to us that would go out of existence should the United Nations take over as a one world government. All right, number two, the UN was founded by communists and CFR members whose common goal was a social world government. And we know that. This is a tale as old as time. So let's just read on. 16 key U.S. officials who shaped the policies leading to the creation of the UN were later exposed in sworn testimony as secret communists. These included Alger Hiss, chief planner of the 1945 founding conference, and the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Dexter White. The Soviet Union under Stalin and the entire Communist Party USA apparatus worked tirelessly to launch the UN. Since its beginning in 1921, the Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR, has always worked for world government under the key CFR founder Edward Mandell House, and in his book Philip Drew, Administrator, called for, quote, socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx, end quote. The CFR was an early promoter of the UN, and 43 members of the U.S. delegation at the UN founding conference were or would become CFR members. So they're all intermixed, and they've all been planning for this and pushing for this as silent, sworn communists. This is from the 20s to the 50s when this really, really got its anchors into government and took over government. This was the movement of the blend or the merge. Number three, the UN has always chosen socialist one-worlders for leaders. The Secretary General at the UN's founding conference was Soviet spy Alger Hiss. He was followed as Secretary General by Norwegian socialist Trygve Lie. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm butchering your name and I apologize. Swedish socialist Dag Hammarskjöld. Burmese Marxist Youthant, Australian former Nazi Kurt Waldheim, Peruvian socialist Javier Perez de Cuellar. I'm sorry, you're just going to have to read along. I know I'm butchering them. I'm doing the best I can here. But I mean no disrespect in this. So here we are. And Egyptian socialist Boutros Boutros-Ghali. Each had consistently used the full resources of the UN to promote communist and socialist causes around the world. The Socialist International, which proudly traces its origins to the first international held by Karl Marx, today claims tens of millions of members in 54 countries. At its 1962 Congress, it declared, "The ultimate objective of the parties of the Socialist International is nothing less than world government. Membership of the United Nations must be made universal. Almost all of the UN's interdependent commissions for the last 30 years have been headed by members of the Socialist International." Okay, number 4. Excuse me. Number 4. The UN seeks power to control the environment, population, children, and the world. And we know this. They're actively working to control weather, which controls environment. They're controlling crops. There are new specific seed strains that if you don't have the fertilizers to unlock the genetic code, your seeds don't even bear a crop. You're just planting for nothing. And the soil is so destroyed too that, you know, your seeds will give you a bumper crop at best unless you condition your soil or buy those GMO seeds. All right, let's just continue here. Number 4, the UN seeks power to control the environment, population, children, and the world. Both the 1972 UN environmental programs and the 1992 UN Conference on Environment and Development laid plans to whip up widespread environmental concerns, some exaggerated and many completely fabricated. These concerns would then be used as justification for increasing UN authority on environmental issues. And boy, they have it now, don't they? The statements and publications of these UN programs leaves little doubt that their goal is a world government with the power to cancel national sovereignty, regulate economic activity, and control the human race, all, of course, under the banter of protecting the environment. I am not the first one saying this, and you can see this among truthers' channels, that we know that the environmental global climate change is a hoax that they are telling us. Now we are experiencing global climate change, but I believe that we are on this cyclical pattern that the Earth has as a recurring natural events, and they could be exacerbated by man, but I certainly believe they are exacerbated by government, especially with the aerosolization that's going on in these proven programs right now. All right, so in late 1994, UN planners meeting in Egypt approved a 20-year, $17 billion plan to, quote-unquote, stabilize the world's population. Did you hear that? In late 1994, UN planners meeting in Egypt approved a 20-year, $17 billion plan to stabilize the world's population. Here we go. The UN's goal is to reduce the population selectively by encouraging abortion, sterilization, and controlled human breeding. Well, that's gross. Okay. Keep your laws off my body. Let's begin with, let's see. Sorry, I get weird when I get tired. It's not meant to come out on camera. All right, the UN Conventions on the Rights of the Child also claims power not only to grant rights, but also to counsel them as provided by law. It claims that governments must guarantee children freedom of expression, freedom to seek, receive, and impair information, and freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, regardless of the wishes of the parents. So that's saying that on behalf of the children, no matter what the parents think, the government is going to stand with the child's ability to choose what they want. So, yeah, that we've seen that in the current media with the vaccinations, where now they're stepping in on behalf of the kids and they're doing it anyway, no matter what the children want, or what the parents want. Sorry. Number 5, the UN Charter outlines the path to world tyranny. After giving lip service about not intervening in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state, The UN Charter continues, but the principles shall not prejudice the application of enforcement measures under Chapter 7. Chapter 7 discusses sanctions and boycotts, but if they are decided to be inadequate, it may take such action by air, sea, or land forces and may be necessary to maintain or restore international peace and security. The UN used this broad assertion and authority as the pretext for its armed intervention in the domestic turmoil in Somalia and Haiti. So did you catch that? They're talking about world tyranny and their right to exercise sanctions by air, sea, or land forces if they perceive a world threat or domestic turmoil. So they're saying that the UN Charter is saying that you guys have the right to govern yourselves, but if we see shit go down, we're coming, and there's nothing you can do about it. And we're going to take over, and you have no choice. Okay, moving on. Number 6, the UN is building its own army to enforce its will. All right, now we're getting into the juicy stuff here. In 1992, UN Secretary General Boutros Ghali, fulfilling a directive from the UN Security Council, unveiled an agenda for peace, or a plan to strengthen UN peacekeeping capabilities. The plan called for armed forces to be made available to the UN on a permanent basis. It ominously warns the time of absolute and exclusive sovereignty has passed, and proceeds to name a long list of risks for stability that would be used to justify use of the permanent UN army to enforce its will. Incredibly, U.S. leaders are using America's military to pave the way for that UN army. In Bosnia, Somalia, Haiti, and elsewhere, foreign UN commanders have controlled our troops. When 15 Americans were killed over Iraq in mid-1994, Vice President Gore extended condolences to the families of those who died in service of the United Nations. Even more incredibly, it has been the official policy of the U.S. government since 1961 to disarm America and create a UN army. Did you hear that? It has been the official policy of the U.S. government since 1961 to disarm America and create a UN army. This policy includes progressive, controlled disarmament that would proceed to the point where no nation would have the military power to challenge the progressively strengthened UN peace force. See State Department Publication 7277, Freedom from War. So there's your reference right there if you want to go read about that further. Here you go. 1994 UN planners meet in Egypt. Oh, nope, sorry, wrong page. There we go. Last paragraph right here. So it's been their agenda all along, since 1961. Okay, number 7. The UN doesn't settle disputes, it makes them worse. Our ambassador to the UN in 1982, although a UN supporter, admitted the UN has become an arena in which countries are drawn into problems they might never have become involved in. Ask yourself, should Seychelles or Benin or Guyana or Barbados have to take sides in a clash that breaks out on the opposite side of the world? When centuries-old animosities erupt in the former Yugoslavia, why does the UN inject its presence with troops, blockades, bombing, and a parade of speeches? American troops serving as globo-cops, I like that term, globo-cops. It's kind of sad. It's very poignant, though, isn't it? For the UN becomes targets for criminals and terrorists. In 1983, 241 U.S. Marines were blown to bits in the Beirut airport. 5 years later, a U.S. Marine lieutenant colonel was kidnapped and eventually murdered by Arab terrorists while in a UN unit in Lebanon. He was unarmed as required by the UN. The UN peacekeeping mission in Somalia cost the lives of another 36 Americans in 1993. And I do remember that. Number 8, the UN ignores communist atrocities but targets non-communist nations and leaders. When Soviet tanks rolled into Hungary in 1950, when the Chinese communists were murdering Tibetans in the 1960s, when the Soviets were butchering civilians in Afghanistan in the 1970s and 80s, when Chechnya was brutalized by the Russians in the 1990s, the UN did nothing. But the UN declared tiny Rhodesia a threat to international peace in the 1960s, enabling pro-communist terrorist Robert Mugabe to seize power. And it was a UN-led campaign that brought self-described communists and convicted terrorist Nelson Mandela to power in South Africa in the 1990s. And that's the whole Mandela effect birth right there when that happened, when he was brought in. Okay, number 9, the UN embraces communists. And that's funny because here they're saying, sorry, let's just back up 2 seconds here, because how do they portray Nelson Mandela? How do they portray him? Self-described communist and convicted terrorist Nelson Mandela to power in South Africa. Okay, number 9, moving on. The UN embraces Communist China, history's most murderous criminal regime. In 1949, anti-communist nationalist China, one of the UN's founding members, was forced from the mainland to Taiwan by the communists. In 1971, the UN expelled Taiwan and embraced the brutal Red Chinese government, a government responsible for over 35 million murders. When the vote admitting Red China was announced, UN delegates danced in the aisles to show their contempt for America and their joy at the triumph of Red China. Okay, sorry. Okay, number 10. We're almost done. Remember, this is only a dozen. So, number 10, the UN is an immoral cesspool filled with perverts and fat cats. In 1993, the UN Economic and Social Council granted consultant status to the International Gay and Lesbian Association, which included the North American Man-Boy Love Association, advocates of child molestation, and the Dutch group Vereniging Martigen. I'm going to show you that, okay? So look right here. I don't even have any dang idea what it is. This. Come on, focus camera. Vereniging Martin. It was which also promotes the use of children as sex objects. Okay, in 1988, the top Belgian UN Children's Fund, UNICEF official, was one of a group convicted of running a child sex ring. That's right. The UN Children's Fund, UNICEF official, was one of a group convicted of running a child sex ring. That's disgusting. Moral bankruptcy is commonplace in UN operations. In Zimbabwe, UNICEF-dominated equipment helped terrorists seize power. In Vietnam, the communists received $13 million from UNICEF, while untold thousands of boat people fled for their lives. Fat cats? UN employees are paid 40% more than comparable U.S. workers who have subsidized rent, take extravagant vacations, are exempt from income taxes, avoid sales tax in UN stores, eat in discounted UN restaurants, and park in discounted UN garages. An ex-UNICEF official confirms that pampered and corseted staffs of various aid agencies absorb 80% of all UN expenditures. So that's really disgusting. They're out there with no limit to their bankroll. They have everything subsidized. They get all these extra perks. They don't pay taxes, and they're pervs. It's disgusting. All right, number 11. America supplies the money. The UN then finances tyrants and assorted enemies of the U.S., and conditions in the nations aided grow worse. In the aided nations. America supplies the money. The UN then finances tyrants and assorted enemies of the US, and conditions in the nations aided grow worse. US taxpayers pay 25% of the UN's budget plus 31% of the UN special agency budgets. That's right, I said it. US taxpayers pay 25% of the UN budget plus 31% of the UN special agency budget. Additional billions of our dollars go to the IMF, World Bank, and other UN-related lending agencies, where they have been used for incredibly wasteful and subversive UN projects. Not surprising, since their agencies were designed by Soviet agent Harry Dexter White and Fabian socialist John Maynard Keynes. Socialist International spokesman Harry Marquand aptly described the IMF as, in essence, a socialist conception. World Bank, here, you want to read along? World Bank aid funds went to brutal Marxist dictator Mengistu while he was creating large-scale starvation and death in Ethiopia, to Tanzanian dictator Julius Nyerere as he drove peasants off their land and burned their huts, and to the Vietnamese communists sending thousands of boat people into the sea. Even Newsweek magazine concluded that the UN's foreign aid programs tend to prop up the incompetent governments or subsidized economies so they can never stand on their own again. All right, we made it to number 12. The UN is a war organization, not a peace organization. And that's really important to remember, that they're a war-driven, they have a very specific agenda, and it's not for the peace and well-being of people. It is not for the good of all mankind around the world. It's for the ultimate control of all mankind all around the world. So, number 12, the UN is a war organization, not a peace organization. Article 42 of the UN Charter claims authority to take such action by air, sea, or land forces as may be necessary to maintain or restore international peace and security. But the UN definition of peace is never given. Tyrannical regimes throughout history have defined peace as the absence of all opposition. To achieve peace in Katuanga in 1961, UN planes bombed hospitals, schools, administrative buildings, and private homes. Katanga was an anti-communist province of the Belgian Congo seeking freedom from the communist-controlled central government. The UN is not now and has never been a peace organization. It will use whatever military power it is given to force all nations of the world to submit. We hope you'll agree that it's vital to get the U.S. out of the United Nations. Okay, we made it through that one, and I know it was quite a bore chore there at the end. I apologize for that. So here's another... Oh, that's a totally different pamphlet we'll save for another time. So, a dozen good reasons to get the United States out of the United Nations, and every single one of them just reinforces what we already know today, that the UN does not have our well-being and security in mind. They just want to make more laws. And don't you find it interesting that we're paying a quarter of their overall budget? So what power do they have over us as a United States, as a nation, as a group of all of our collective states, where we should have this sovereignty to govern ourselves, yet we are pledging 25% of their annual budget from our taxes. Did you know that? I didn't know that. All right, well, more food for your brain, right? Okay, we're going to move on to the next one right away. So thanks for joining me. Just Christina, signing out.